Africa, a continent of vibrant cultures, breathtaking landscapes, and immense potential. For decades it has grappled with challenges of poverty, underdevelopment, and political instability. But today, a new narrative is unfolding. A story of rapid urbanization, infrastructural development, and economic growth. Across its vast plains and bustling cities, a transformation is underway, fueled by a surge in foreign investment, particularly from the east. Gleaming new highways now snake through once isolated regions, connecting communities and facilitating trade. The African landscape is being redrawn, and at the heart of this transformation is a powerful player, China. Is China's involvement in Africa a genuine effort to foster development, or is it a calculated strategy to secure resources and expand its geopolitical clout? The allure of Chinese investment is undeniable. For many African nations struggling to attract foreign capital, China offers a lifeline. Unlike traditional Western donors who often attach stringent conditions to their aid packages, China presents itself as a more pragmatic partner. This no-strings-attached approach has resonated with some African leaders. Moreover, China's development model, characterized by rapid industrialization and infrastructure-led growth, holds a certain appeal. The prospect of replicating China's success is tantalizing. New roads and railways are facilitating the movement of goods and people, connecting markets and unlocking economic potential. Improved access to electricity is powering homes, businesses, and industries. On the surface, it appears to be a mutually beneficial partnership. Yet beneath this veneer of progress, a more complex reality is taking shape. The scale of Chinese lending to Africa is staggering. Over the past 2 decades, China has become Africa's largest creditor. While the exact figures are shrouded in secrecy, estimates suggest African countries owe China hundreds of billions of dollars. This lending spree has raised concerns about debt sustainability. Critics accuse China of engaging in debt-trap diplomacy. This deliberate indebtedness gives the creditor leverage over the debtor. In the context of China's involvement in Africa, critics argue that the terms of these loans are often opaque. They point to cases like Sri Lanka, where the government was forced to lease a strategically important port to a Chinese company for 99 years. As debt burdens mount, some African nations are finding themselves vulnerable to Chinese pressure. The debate over China's debt-trap diplomacy in Africa is complex and nuanced. The relationship between China and Africa is at a crossroads. What began as a promising partnership has become increasingly fraught with complexity and uncertainty. The narrative of a rising Africa, fueled by Chinese investment, is now intertwined with concerns about debt sustainability and economic dependence. The question is no longer whether China is a force to be reckoned with in Africa. That much is evident. The more pressing question is what role China will ultimately play in shaping the continent's future. Will it be a force for good, a catalyst for sustainable development, or will it prioritize its own interests? The answer lies somewhere in the gray areas, in the complex interplay of power, economics, and diplomacy. The decisions made by African leaders in the coming years will have profound implications for the continent's trajectory. The allure of Chinese investment is particularly strong in Africa. For decades, African nations have struggled to secure funding for essential projects. Traditional lenders often imposed stringent conditions on their loans. Enter China, with its vast reserves of foreign currency and its ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. Unlike their Western counterparts, Chinese lenders offered loans with fewer strings attached. This no-strings-attached approach proved irresistible to many African leaders. The influx of Chinese money fueled a construction boom across the continent. For a time, it seemed like a win-win situation. However, the easy money that initially seemed like a blessing began to reveal its hidden costs. Loan repayments became increasingly burdensome, and the opaque terms of some deals raised concerns about corruption and mismanagement. The dangers of unchecked Chinese lending were starkly illustrated in Sri Lanka. In 2017, after years of heavy borrowing from China, Sri Lanka found itself unable to service its debts. Faced with a looming financial crisis, the Sri Lankan government was forced to make a desperate deal with China. In exchange for a debt write-off, Sri Lanka agreed to lease the strategically important Hambantota port to a Chinese state-owned company for 99 years. The deal sent shockwaves through the international community. Critics accused China of predatory lending practices. The Sri Lankan case became a rallying cry for those who warned of the dangers of Chinese debt trap diplomacy in Africa. It underscored the need for African governments to carefully scrutinize loan agreements and assess their long-term debt sustainability. Debt trap diplomacy follows a predictable pattern. It typically begins with a powerful country identifying a smaller, economically vulnerable nation as a potential target. The powerful country then offers loans on seemingly favorable terms. The target country often fails to adequately assess the long-term financial implications of these loans. Projects are approved without proper feasibility studies. As the debt burden mounts, the target country finds itself increasingly reliant on the creditor country. This dependence creates leverage for the creditor country, which can then exert pressure to extract economic or geopolitical concessions. Debt trap diplomacy is a subtle but potent tool of neocolonialism. Beyond infrastructure, the implications of Chinese debt trap diplomacy extend far beyond the realm of economics. As African nations become increasingly indebted to China, they also become more entangled in a web of obligations. Chinese companies have flooded African markets with cheap manufactured goods, undercutting local producers. This flood of imports has made many African countries heavily reliant on China for essential goods. While Chinese companies often promise to create jobs for local workers, they often bring in their own labor force from China. This practice limits the transfer of skills and technology that could help build local capacity. China's growing economic clout in Africa has translated into political influence. African governments are often reluctant to criticize China's human rights record. The cumulative effect of these entanglements is a gradual erosion of sovereignty. While this dependence may not manifest in the form of outright territorial control, it limits the ability of African nations to chart their own course. The specter of China's growing influence in Africa has led some observers to draw parallels with the scramble for Africa. While the historical context is different, there are undeniable similarities. China is leveraging its economic might to secure access to resources and establish a strategic foothold. This new scramble for Africa is not just about economic gain, it also has profound geopolitical implications. China's growing influence in Africa challenges the traditional dominance of Western powers. The continent is becoming a key battleground in the emerging rivalry between the United States and China. The question now is whether African nations can avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. The answers to these questions will shape the destiny of Africa for generations to come. Zambia, once a shining beacon of African independence and a major copper producer, now finds itself grappling with a staggering debt burden, much of it owed to China. The country's economic woes, exacerbated by falling copper prices, mismanagement and corruption, have pushed it to the brink of a sovereign debt crisis, making it a prime example of the potential pitfalls of unchecked Chinese lending. For years, Zambia embraced Chinese investment, welcoming the influx of capital for infrastructure projects and the promise of economic growth. Chinese companies poured billions of dollars into roads, bridges, power plants and airports, transforming the country's landscape and fueling a construction boom. However, this development came at a steep price. As Zambia's debt to China ballooned, so too did concerns about its ability to repay these loans. The terms of many deals were shrouded in secrecy, lacking transparency and raising concerns about potential corruption and asset seizures. The International Monetary Fund issued warnings about Zambia's unsustainable debt levels, urging the government to exercise caution and prioritize fiscal prudence. Despite these warnings, Zambia continued to borrow heavily from China, driven by a combination of political expediency, ambitious development plans, and a belief that China offered a more pragmatic and less intrusive partner than traditional Western lenders. However, as copper prices plummeted and the global economy slowed, Zambia found itself caught in a debt trap, unable to service its obligations and facing the prospect of defaulting on its loans. The situation in Zambia serves as a sobering reminder of the risks associated with relying too heavily on a single creditor, particularly one with a history of using debt as leverage to extract economic and geopolitical concessions. It highlights the importance of diversification, transparency, and responsible debt management for African nations seeking to attract foreign investment without compromising their long-term economic sovereignty. Djibouti, a small but strategically located nation on the Horn of Africa, has emerged as a focal point of China's growing military and economic ambitions in the region. With its proximity to key shipping lanes and its importance as a gateway to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, Djibouti has become a coveted prize in the global competition for influence and access. China's interest in Djibouti is multifaceted. Economically, the country offers access to the Red Sea, a vital artery for global trade, and serves as a potential hub for China's Belt and Road Initiative, connecting Asia to Africa and Europe. Militarily, Djibouti provides a strategic foothold for China's expanding naval presence, allowing it to project power into the Indian Ocean and beyond. China's involvement in Djibouti has been swift and substantial. It has financed and constructed a modern port, a free trade zone, and a railway linking Djibouti to landlocked Ethiopia, its main trading partner. These infrastructure projects have been accompanied by a surge in Chinese investment and trade, making China Djibouti's largest trading partner and creditor. However, China's growing influence in Djibouti has raised concerns among Western powers, particularly the United States, which maintains a significant military presence in the country. The establishment of China's first overseas military base in Djibouti in 2017 was met with alarm in Washington, signaling a shift in the regional balance of power and raising questions about China's long-term strategic intentions. Djibouti's experience illustrates the geopolitical complexities of China's engagement in Africa. While Chinese investment has undoubtedly brought economic benefits, it has also heightened tensions with Western powers and raised concerns about Djibouti's ability to maintain its sovereignty and independence amid a global power struggle. Kenya, East Africa's economic powerhouse, has witnessed a surge in Chinese investment in recent years, particularly in the infrastructure sector. The most notable example of this partnership is the Standard Gauge Railway, a multi-billion-dollar project financed and constructed by China that links the port city of Mombasa to the capital, Nairobi, and beyond. The Standard Gauge Railway, hailed as a transformative project that would boost trade, reduce transportation costs, and enhance regional connectivity, was initially welcomed by the Kenyan government and public alike. However, as the project progressed, concerns began to mount about its financial viability, the terms of the loan agreement with China, and the potential for Kenya to fall into a debt trap. Critics of the Standard Gauge Railway project argued that it was overpriced, that the loan terms were unfavorable, and that the project would struggle to generate sufficient revenue to cover its operating costs and debt repayments. They pointed to the fact that much of the cargo traffic that the Standard Gauge Railway was intended to carry was still being transported by road, raising doubts about the project's economic viability. Furthermore, the lack of transparency surrounding the Standard Gauge Railway deal, particularly with regard to the loan terms and conditions, fueled suspicions about potential corruption and hidden costs. The Kenyan government's reluctance to disclose the full details of the agreement only served to deepen these concerns. The Standard Gauge Railway project in Kenya highlights the importance of conducting thorough feasibility studies, ensuring transparency and accountability in infrastructure projects, and carefully assessing the long-term financial implications of large-scale loans, particularly those from countries with a history of using debt as leverage to advance their strategic interests. Ethiopia, a rapidly developing nation in the Horn of Africa, has sought to strike a delicate balance in its relations with China, seeking to attract investment and development assistance while safeguarding its independence and sovereignty. China has become a major economic partner for Ethiopia, financing and constructing roads, railways, industrial parks, and telecommunications infrastructure. Ethiopia's government, led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, has adopted a pragmatic approach to foreign investment, welcoming Chinese capital but also seeking to diversify its partnerships and avoid becoming overly reliant on any single country. Ethiopia has also sought to attract investment from other countries, including the United States, Turkey, and the European Union, as part of its strategy to balance its foreign relations. One area where Ethiopia has been particularly careful is in the management of its debt. While the country has borrowed heavily from China, it has also sought to restructure its debt obligations, extend repayment periods, and secure more favorable terms. Ethiopia has also been praised for its efforts to improve governance, tackle corruption, and create a more transparent and accountable business environment. Ethiopia's approach to managing its relationship with China offers valuable lessons for other African nations seeking to attract foreign investment without compromising their long-term economic and political independence. By diversifying its partnerships, prioritizing debt sustainability, and strengthening governance, Ethiopia is seeking to chart a course that balances its development aspirations with its commitment to sovereignty. Section 5. A looming debt crisis. A continent at a crossroads. As the scale of Chinese lending to Africa has grown, so too have concerns about the sustainability of this debt burden and the potential for a continent-wide debt crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic, with its devastating economic impact, has exacerbated these concerns, pushing many African nations to the brink of default and forcing them to seek debt relief from their creditors, including China. The risks associated with a potential African debt crisis are profound. Defaulting on debt obligations could lead to a loss of investor confidence, making it more difficult and expensive for African countries to access international capital markets in the future. It could also trigger a wave of austerity measures, leading to cuts in essential public services and exacerbating poverty and inequality. Moreover, a debt crisis could have significant geopolitical implications, potentially undermining the progress that African nations have made in recent decades toward greater democracy, stability, and economic development. It could also increase the risk of social unrest and political instability, creating opportunities for extremist groups to exploit grievances and further destabilize the continent. Addressing the looming African debt crisis requires a concerted and coordinated effort from both debtors and creditors. African governments must prioritize debt sustainability, transparency, and good governance, while international creditors, including China, must demonstrate flexibility and a willingness to restructure debt obligations to prevent a catastrophic economic collapse. Section 6. The price of default, beyond economic repercussions. The consequences of defaulting on loans from China extend far beyond the realm of economics. While the immediate impact would be felt in the form of credit downgrades, higher borrowing costs, and potential legal challenges, the long-term implications for a country's sovereignty, diplomatic relations, and international standing can be even more significant. One of the most concerning aspects of China's debt trap diplomacy is its potential to undermine the sovereignty of African nations. As countries become increasingly indebted to China, they become more vulnerable to pressure to make concessions that may not be in their national interest, such as granting access to strategic resources, supporting China's foreign policy positions, or censoring criticism of China's human rights record. Furthermore, defaulting on loans from China could damage a country's diplomatic relations with Beijing. China has a history of using its economic leverage to punish countries that challenge its interests, and a default could lead to a cooling of relations, a reduction in investment, and even diplomatic isolation. Moreover, defaulting on debt obligations can tarnish a country's international reputation, making it less attractive to foreign investors and potentially hindering its ability to participate in global trade and finance. This can have a devastating impact on a country's economic development prospects and its ability to provide for the needs of its citizens. Therefore, it is essential for African nations to approach their debt obligations to China with caution, ensuring transparency, accountability, and a focus on sustainable development that benefits their citizens, not just the narrow interests of foreign creditors. Section 7. A call for transparency and accountability. The growing concerns about China's debt trap diplomacy in Africa highlight the urgent need for greater transparency and accountability in lending practices. Opaque deals negotiated behind closed doors without public scrutiny create fertile ground for corruption, mismanagement, and the erosion of national sovereignty. International organizations such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have a crucial role to play in promoting responsible lending practices and ensuring that loans are used for their intended purpose, to support sustainable development and improve the lives of ordinary citizens. They can do this by providing technical assistance to African governments, strengthening debt management capacity, and advocating for greater transparency in loan agreements. Moreover, Western governments and democratic institutions have a responsibility to offer African nations a viable alternative to Chinese debt trap diplomacy. This means providing development assistance on fair and transparent terms, promoting good governance and the rule of law, and supporting African-led initiatives to address the continent's development challenges. Ultimately, the responsibility for avoiding the debt trap lies with African governments themselves. They must prioritize transparency, accountability, and sound debt management practices, ensuring that loans are used for projects that benefit their citizens and contribute to sustainable and inclusive economic growth. By doing so, they can harness the power of foreign investment to drive development while safeguarding their sovereignty and securing a brighter future for their people. As Chinese investment poured into Africa, so too did a tidal wave of Chinese goods, flooding markets across the continent. From textiles and electronics to construction materials and household appliances, Chinese products, often priced significantly lower than their local counterparts, began to dominate shelves and stalls, transforming the consumer landscape and presenting both opportunities and challenges for African economies. This influx of affordable goods was initially welcomed by many consumers, particularly those in lower-income brackets, who suddenly had access to a wider variety of products at price points they could afford. The availability of cheap Chinese clothing, shoes, and household items eased the burden on strained budgets, allowing families to stretch their incomes further. Moreover, the arrival of and entrepreneurs injected a new dynamism into local economies. They established shops, restaurants, and businesses, creating jobs and stimulating economic activity. Their presence brought with it new skills, technologies, and business practices, fostering a spirit of entrepreneurship and introducing African consumers to new products and services. However, beneath the surface of this apparent consumer bonanza, a more complex and concerning reality was taking shape. The influx of cheap Chinese imports began to displace locally produced goods, threatening the viability of domestic industries and undermining efforts to foster industrialization and create sustainable employment opportunities for African workers. The textile industry, a significant source of employment in many African countries, was particularly hard hit. Factories that once buzzed with activity fell silent as consumers opted for cheaper Chinese alternatives, leading to job losses, factory closures, and a decline in manufacturing capacity. The situation was mirrored in other sectors, from footwear and furniture to electronics and construction materials, as Chinese competition eroded the competitiveness of local producers. The arrival of Chinese businesses in Africa sparked a David and Goliath struggle, pitting small-scale local entrepreneurs against well-funded and often state-backed Chinese companies. While some African businesses adapted and thrived in this new competitive landscape, many others found themselves struggling to survive, facing an uphill battle against a formidable economic force. Chinese businesses, often operating with lower overhead costs, access to cheaper financing, and a willingness to undercut competitors on price, gained a significant advantage in the marketplace. They were able to offer products at prices that local businesses simply could not match, squeezing profit margins and forcing many smaller operators out of business. The impact was particularly acute in sectors where Chinese companies had a competitive edge, such as construction, manufacturing, and retail. Local construction firms, for example, found it increasingly difficult to secure contracts as Chinese companies, often bringing their own labor force and materials, submitted bids that were significantly lower than their local counterparts. This uneven playing field had far-reaching consequences not only for individual businesses, but also for the broader economy. The displacement of local businesses led to job losses, reduced tax revenues, and a decline in economic activity in sectors where Chinese competition was most intense. Moreover, the influx of Chinese businesses often stifled the growth of local entrepreneurship. young Africans, seeking to start their own businesses, found themselves facing formidable barriers to entry, discouraged by the dominance of Chinese companies, and the difficulty of competing in a market flooded with cheap imports. The challenges faced by local businesses highlighted the need for African governments to implement policies that fostered a more level playing field, supporting the growth of domestic industries, promoting fair competition, and ensuring that the benefits of Chinese investment were shared more equitably. One of the key selling points of Chinese investment in Africa was the promise of job creation. With unemployment rates soaring, particularly among young people, the prospect of large-scale infrastructure projects, factories, and businesses generating employment opportunities was a tantalizing prospect for many African governments and their citizens. While Chinese investment did create jobs, the reality often fell short of the hype. Chinese companies, particularly in sectors like construction and manufacturing, often brought in their own labor force from China, citing a lack of skilled workers in Africa as justification. This practice, however, deprived local communities of much-needed employment opportunities and limited the potential for skills transfer and technology sharing. Moreover, the jobs that were created for locals were often low-paying, unskilled positions with poor working conditions. Reports of labor abuses, including long hours, low wages, and unsafe working environments, surfaced at Chinese-run businesses in various sectors, raising concerns about exploitation and the erosion of labor standards. Furthermore, the influx of Chinese workers into Africa created social tensions in some communities. Competition for jobs, housing, and resources led to resentment and, in some cases, sparked xenophobic violence, highlighting the need for careful management of migration flows and the importance of ensuring that the benefits of foreign investment were shared more equitably. The labor dynamics of Chinese investment in Africa underscored the need for a more nuanced approach to job creation, one that prioritized the creation of decent work opportunities for local communities, facilitated skills transfer, and ensured that the benefits of economic growth were more broadly shared. Section 4. Beyond cheap goods, a deeper look at economic dependence. The influx of Chinese goods and businesses into Africa, while offering some immediate benefits, also raised concerns about the potential for long-term economic dependence. As African countries became increasingly reliant on China for manufactured goods, infrastructure financing, and even basic necessities, questions arose about the impact on their ability to develop diversified and resilient economies. This dependence manifested in various ways. On the trade front, many African countries developed significant trade deficits with China, importing far more than they exported. This imbalance was particularly pronounced in countries rich in natural resources, such as oil, minerals, and timber, which were often exported to China in raw form, with little value-added processing taking place locally. This dependence on raw material exports left African economies vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity prices, which were often beyond their control. A sudden drop in the price of oil, for example, could have a devastating impact on an oil-exporting African country heavily reliant on China as a buyer, leading to a decline in export earnings, government revenues, and economic activity. Furthermore, the influx of Chinese loans for infrastructure projects, while often presented as a form of development assistance, further deepened this dependence. As African countries accumulated debt to China, they became increasingly beholden to their creditor, potentially limiting their ability to make independent economic and political decisions. This growing economic dependence raised concerns about a new form of neo-colonialism, where African nations, while politically independent, remained economically tethered to a more powerful global power, their destinies intertwined in a complex web of trade, investment, and debt. Section 5. The Spectre of Neocolonialism, Echoes of Exploitation in a Globalized World. The rapid expansion of China's economic footprint in Africa, while often framed in the language of win-win cooperation and mutual benefit, evoked uncomfortable parallels to a darker chapter in the continent's history, the era of European colonialism. While China's engagement in Africa differed in many respects from the outright territorial control that characterized European colonialism, it raised concerns about a new form of neo-colonialism, where economic power was leveraged to exert influence, extract resources, and shape the destinies of nations. Critics of China's approach pointed to the extractive nature of many Chinese investments, which often focused on securing access to Africa's vast natural resources, such as oil, minerals, and timber, to fuel China's own burgeoning economy. These resources were often extracted with little regard for environmental sustainability or the long-term development needs of African countries. Furthermore, the lack of transparency and accountability in many Chinese deals, often negotiated behind closed doors with little public scrutiny, fueled suspicions about corruption, exploitation, and the potential for African countries to be saddled with unsustainable debt burdens that could compromise their long-term economic sovereignty. The specter of neocolonialism loomed large in discussions about China's role in Africa, raising questions about whether the continent was merely exchanging one form of dependence for another, this time with a rising global power seeking to secure its own strategic interests. The challenge for African leaders was to navigate this complex geopolitical landscape, leveraging China's investment to their advantage while safeguarding their sovereignty, promoting sustainable development, and ensuring that the benefits of economic growth were shared equitably among their citizens. Section 6. A Crossroads for Africa, Navigating the Challenges and Opportunities of Chinese Engagement. China's emergence as a major economic and geopolitical force in Africa presented both opportunities and challenges for the continent. While Chinese investment offered the potential to accelerate economic growth, bridge the infrastructure gap, and create employment opportunities, it also raised concerns about debt sustainability, economic dependence, and the erosion of sovereignty. The key for African nations was to engage with China strategically, leveraging its investment to their advantage while mitigating the risks. This required a multi-pronged approach that included promoting transparency and accountability, negotiating loan agreements and investment deals in a transparent manner, with public scrutiny and parliamentary oversight, to ensure that they serve the national interest and do not saddle future generations with unsustainable debt burdens. Prioritizing sustainable development, focusing on investments that promote inclusive economic growth, create decent work opportunities for local communities, and contribute to environmental sustainability rather than simply extracting resources or pursuing short-term economic gains. Diversifying partnerships, avoiding over-reliance on any single country, including China, by seeking investment and trade partnerships with a wider range of countries and regions, including other emerging economies, to reduce dependence and enhance bargaining power. Strengthening governance and institutions, tackling corruption, improving governance, and strengthening institutions to create a more stable and predictable investment climate, attract responsible investors, and ensure that the benefits of economic growth are shared more equitably. By adopting a strategic and proactive approach to Chinese engagement, African nations could harness the power of foreign investment to drive development while safeguarding their sovereignty, promoting inclusive growth, and shaping a more prosperous and equitable future for their people. The choices made in the coming years would determine whether China's rise would be a blessing or a curse for the continent, a catalyst for progress, or a harbinger of a new era of dependence. For decades, China maintained a relatively low military profile on the global stage, focusing its energies on domestic economic development and cautiously navigating a complex geopolitical landscape. However, as China's economic and political might grew, so too did its military ambitions. The sleeping dragon, it seemed, was beginning to stir, its growing military prowess sending ripples across the globe and raising concerns about its intentions. This military buildup was driven by a number of factors. Economically, China's expanding global trade network and its dependence on foreign energy sources, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, necessitated a stronger military presence to protect its interests and secure vital shipping lanes. Politically, China sought to assert its position as a rising global power, challenging the long-standing dominance of the United States and its allies. This ambition was evident in China's increasingly assertive stance in regional disputes, such as the South China Sea, and its growing military footprint in strategic locations around the world. Ideologically, China's leadership, under President Xi Jinping, embraced a more nationalistic and assertive foreign policy, emphasizing China's rightful place as a leading power in the world, and its determination to defend its interests, both at home and abroad. This confluence of economic, political, and ideological factors fueled a rapid modernization and expansion of China's military capabilities. The People's Liberation Army underwent a significant transformation, investing heavily in advanced weaponry, including aircraft carriers, stealth fighters, hypersonic missiles, and cyber warfare capabilities. This military buildup did not go unnoticed. Western powers, particularly the United States, expressed growing concern about China's military ambitions and their potential implications for global security and stability. The stage was set for a new era of great power competition, with China's growing military might poised to reshape the geopolitical landscape. In 2017, China inaugurated its first overseas military base in Djibouti, a small but strategically located nation on the Horn of Africa. This move, a significant departure from China's traditional policy of non-interventionism, signaled a new era in China's military posture, marking its transition from a regional power to a global military actor with interests and ambitions far beyond its borders. The choice of Djibouti as the location for China's first overseas military base was no accident. Situated at the entrance to the Red Sea, a vital artery for global trade connecting Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, Djibouti offered China a strategic foothold in a region of immense economic and geopolitical significance. The base, located just a few miles from a U.S. military base, provided China with a platform to project power into the Indian Ocean, a region of growing importance for China's energy security and trade routes. It also gave China a logistical hub for its growing naval presence in the region, allowing it to support anti-piracy operations, provide humanitarian assistance, and evacuate Chinese nationals from conflict zones. The establishment of the Djibouti base was met with mixed reactions. China maintained that the base was purely defensive in nature, intended to support its efforts to maintain peace and stability in the region and protect its legitimate economic interests. However, Western powers, particularly the United States, expressed concern that the base could be used to project Chinese military power further afield, potentially challenging U.S. dominance in the region and destabilizing the existing security architecture. Djibouti, for its part, welcomed the Chinese investment and the economic benefits that came with it. However, the presence of a Chinese military base on its soil also raised questions about Djibouti's long-term sovereignty and its ability to navigate the complex geopolitical rivalries between global powers on its doorstep. The Djibouti base became a lightning rod for anxieties about China's growing military ambitions and its potential to reshape the global balance of power. It served as a tangible reminder that China was no longer content to remain on the sidelines of global affairs, but was increasingly willing to assert its presence and project its military might in pursuit of its interests. While the Djibouti base garnered significant attention, it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a single node in a rapidly expanding web of Chinese military influence that stretched across the globe. From port facilities and logistical hubs to arms sales and military exercises, China was steadily increasing its military footprint in strategic locations, securing access, and projecting its power in regions once considered outside its traditional sphere of influence. In Southeast Asia, China asserted its territorial claims in the South China Sea, constructing artificial islands and deploying military assets to reinforce its presence in disputed waters, raising tensions with neighboring countries and the United States. In Central Asia, China expanded its military cooperation with countries like Pakistan and Tajikistan, conducting joint military exercises and providing arms and training to bolster their defense capabilities, countering U.S. influence in the region. In the Middle East, China deepened its security ties with countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, signing arms deals, conducting joint naval patrols in the Persian Gulf, and seeking to secure its energy interests in a volatile region. In Latin America, China increased its military sales and training programs, providing countries like Venezuela and Bolivia with weapons systems and technology, extending its influence in a region traditionally considered the backyard of the United States. This global expansion of China's military influence was driven by a combination of economic, political, and strategic imperatives. Economically, China sought to secure its access to vital resources, protect its trade routes, and safeguard its overseas investments, particularly in developing countries where political instability and security risks were often high. Politically, China aimed to challenge the dominance of the United States and its allies, establishing a global security architecture that better reflected China's interests and ambitions. This involved forging new alliances, building partnerships with countries wary of U.S. hegemony, and creating a counterbalance to American power. Strategically, China sought to secure its borders, protect its core interests, and deter potential adversaries from challenging its rise as a global power. This involved developing a blue water navy capable of operating far from China's shores, establishing a network of overseas bases and logistical hubs, and enhancing its ability to project power globally. Section 4. The Drums of Doubt. Concerns over China's military aspirations. China's growing military might and its expanding global footprint have not gone unnoticed or unchallenged. Western powers, led by the United States, have expressed growing concern about China's ultimate intentions, fearing that its military ambitions could destabilize the existing global order and lead to a new era of great power conflict. One of the primary concerns was the lack of transparency surrounding China's military buildup. Unlike the United States, which regularly publishes defense white papers outlining its military strategy and spending priorities, China's defense budget and its long-term military plans remain shrouded in secrecy, fueling suspicions and mistrust among its rivals. Furthermore, China's increasingly assertive actions in regional disputes, such as the South China Sea, its crackdown on dissent in Hong Kong, and its human rights record in Xinjiang, raised questions about its commitment to international law, human rights, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. The fear among Western powers was that China, as its power grew, would seek to reshape the global order in its own image, creating a world where might trumped right, authoritarianism gained ground at the expense of democracy, and China's interests took precedence over those of smaller and weaker nations. This fear was compounded by the ideological divide between China and the West. China's authoritarian political system, its state-controlled economy, and its rejection of Western values such as freedom of speech and democracy, fueled anxieties about a future where China's influence challenged the fundamental principles of the liberal international order. The growing rivalry between China and the United States had profound implications for global security and stability. It raised the specter of a new Cold War, characterized by mistrust, suspicion, and the potential for miscalculation and conflict. The challenge for the international community was to find ways to manage this rivalry peacefully, encouraging dialogue, cooperation, and the peaceful resolution of disputes, while also upholding the rules-based international order that had underpinned global stability for decades. The stakes were high and the consequences of failure were potentially catastrophic. Section 1. A Continent Divided. The Fault Lines of Opinion. The rapid expansion of China's footprint in Africa, from towering skyscrapers to sprawling infrastructure projects, has ignited a fierce debate across the continent, exposing deep divisions over the true nature and implications of this burgeoning partnership. Public opinion, once characterized by cautious optimism and a thirst for development aid, has fractured along fault lines of ideology, economic interest, and national pride. For some, particularly within government circles and business elites who have directly benefited from Chinese investment and access to lucrative contracts, China represents a powerful ally, a generous benefactor, and a catalyst for economic transformation. They point to the tangible evidence of progress, new roads, railways, ports, and power plants, as proof that China is delivering on its promises and helping to lift Africa out of poverty. These proponents of closer ties with China often view Western criticism of Chinese engagement as hypocritical, a thinly veiled attempt to maintain their own economic and geopolitical dominance while stifling Africa's development aspirations. They argue that Africa has the right to choose its own partners and chart its own course, free from interference from former colonial powers, still clinging to outdated notions of paternalism and control. However, this narrative of a win-win partnership, a harmonious convergence of interests between China and Africa, is increasingly challenged by a growing chorus of dissent, a groundswell of opposition fueled by anxieties about debt sustainability, economic dependence, and the erosion of sovereignty. This dissenting view finds expression among academics, civil society groups, labor unions, and opposition politicians who view China's growing influence with a mix of suspicion, skepticism, and, in some cases, outright hostility. They argue that China's engagement in Africa is driven primarily by self-interest, a calculated strategy to secure access to resources, expand its geopolitical clout, and establish a neo-colonial presence in a region rich in potential but vulnerable to exploitation. Section 2. The Voices of Dissent, From Whispers to Roars. The voices of dissent, once confined to academic journals, policy forums, and the hushed whispers of concerned citizens, have grown louder and more insistent in recent years, spilling onto the streets in protests and demonstrations that reflect a growing unease with China's expanding footprint in Africa. In Zambia, once hailed as a model of China-Africa cooperation, protests erupted over the government's handling of its mounting debt to China, with accusations of corruption, mismanagement, and the potential seizure of strategic assets, such as the National Power Company, as collateral for unpaid loans. In Kenya, concerns about the financial viability of the Chinese-built standard gauge railway, its exorbitant cost, and the lack of transparency surrounding the loan agreement, sparked public outcry and calls for greater accountability from the government. In Nigeria, protests erupted over the influx of Chinese goods, which were blamed for the decline of local industries, job losses, and the erosion of Nigeria's manufacturing base. In South Africa, labor unions staged demonstrations against Chinese companies accused of exploiting workers, paying low wages, and providing poor working conditions, highlighting the social tensions that can arise from an influx of foreign workers and businesses. These protests, while often met with heavy-handed responses from governments eager to protect their relationships with China, reflected a growing awareness among ordinary Africans of the potential pitfalls of unchecked Chinese investment and the importance of demanding transparency, accountability, and equitable development. The message from these protests was clear. China's engagement in Africa could not come at the expense of sovereignty, economic justice, or the well-being of African citizens. A true partnership, one based on mutual respect and shared prosperity, required a more balanced and equitable approach, one that prioritized the needs and aspirations of African people. The challenge for African leaders, caught between the allure of Chinese investment and the anxieties it has engendered, is to find a way to navigate this complex relationship strategically, maximizing the benefits of Chinese engagement while mitigating the risks. It is a delicate balancing act, requiring a nuanced understanding of both the opportunities and the potential pitfalls of this burgeoning partnership. On the one hand, African nations cannot afford to ignore the potential of China's economic might to help bridge the infrastructure gap, create employment opportunities, and accelerate economic growth. China's willingness to invest in sectors where Western companies have been reluctant to tread, its less stringent lending practices, and its pragmatic approach to development assistance all hold considerable appeal for African governments eager to deliver tangible benefits to their citizens. On the other hand, African leaders must also be mindful of the risks associated with becoming overly reliant on a single economic partner, particularly one with a history of using its economic clout to advance its geopolitical interests. The specter of debt-trap diplomacy, the erosion of sovereignty, and the displacement of local businesses by Chinese competition are all legitimate concerns that cannot be ignored. Navigating this complex terrain requires a multi-pronged approach, a delicate dance between pragmatism and principle, engagement and caution. African governments must prioritize transparency and accountability, ensuring that loan agreements and investment deals are negotiated in the best interests of their citizens, not just the narrow interests of foreign investors. Furthermore, African nations must focus on building diversified economies, reducing their dependence on raw material exports, and promoting industrialization and value-added processing to create sustainable employment opportunities and enhance their competitiveness in the global marketplace. The narrative of China in Africa is not yet fully written. It is a story still unfolding, a complex tapestry woven from threads of opportunity, ambition, anxiety, and hope. The future of this relationship, and its impact on the lives of millions of Africans, hinges on the choices made today, not just by China, but by African leaders and citizens themselves. The power to shape this narrative, to determine whether China's rise will be a blessing or a curse for Africa, lies ultimately in the hands of Africans themselves. By embracing transparency, demanding accountability, prioritizing sustainable development, and strengthening their own institutions, African nations can harness the power of foreign investment to drive progress while safeguarding their sovereignty and securing a brighter future for their people. The path ahead will not be easy. There will be challenges, setbacks, and difficult choices to be made. But by learning from the experiences of others, by engaging with China and other global partners strategically, and by prioritizing the needs and aspirations of their own citizens, African nations can chart a course toward a future where their voices are heard, their choices respected, and their destinies determined by their own hands. The world is watching, eager to see whether Africa can defy the skeptics, overcome the challenges, and forge a new path toward prosperity and self-reliance in the 21st century. The stakes are high, the potential immense, and the time for action is now. The future of Africa, as always, remains unwritten, a blank page awaiting the inscription of its own destiny. China's emergence as a dominant force in Africa has reshaped the continent's economic, political, and social landscape, creating a complex and often contradictory tapestry of opportunities and challenges. The narrative of China in Africa defies simplistic categorization, resisting easy labels of savior or neo-colonialist. The sheer scale of Chinese investment, the billions of dollars poured into infrastructure projects, has undeniably transformed Africa's physical landscape, connecting remote regions, facilitating trade, and fueling economic growth. The availability of affordable Chinese goods has brought consumer products within reach of millions, while Chinese businesses have injected a new dynamism into local economies, creating jobs and stimulating entrepreneurship. However, this engagement has not come without costs. The mounting debt burden faced by many African nations, the influx of Chinese labor often at the expense of local workers, and the flood of cheap imports that have undermined domestic industries have all raised concerns about sustainability, equity, and the potential for a new form of dependency. The question of whether China is a force for good or ill in Africa is not one with a simple answer. The reality is far more nuanced, a complex equation with multiple variables, each carrying its own weight, its own potential for both progress and peril. The challenge for Africa is not to reject Chinese engagement outright, nor to embrace it blindly, but to engage strategically, leveraging the opportunities while mitigating the risks. This requires a clear-eyed assessment of national interests, a commitment to transparency and accountability, and a determination to negotiate from a position of strength, not desperation. The future of Africa, as always, remains unwritten, a blank canvas awaiting the brushstrokes of its own people. The narrative of China in Africa, while a significant chapter in the continent's story, is just one strand in a much larger tapestry, one that encompasses the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of over 1 billion people. The time has come for Africa to move beyond the rhetoric of dependence, to shed the shackles of colonial legacies and neo-colonial ambitions, and to embrace its own agency, its own power to shape its destiny. This requires a fundamental shift in mindset, a rejection of the narrative of victimhood, and a bold embrace of the continent's potential for self-reliance, innovation, and sustainable prosperity. African leaders must prioritize good governance, transparency, and accountability, creating an environment where corruption is not tolerated, where the rule of law prevails, and where the voices of citizens are heard and respected. They must invest in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, empowering their people with the tools and opportunities they need to thrive in a rapidly changing world. Moreover, African nations must harness the power of their collective strength, forging stronger regional partnerships, promoting intra-African trade, and speaking with a united voice on the global stage to advance their shared interests and secure their rightful place in the community of nations. The journey ahead will not be easy. There will be challenges, setbacks, and difficult choices to be made. But by embracing the spirit of Pan-Africanism, by working together to build a more prosperous and equitable continent, Africa can overcome the obstacles it faces and create a future worthy of its people's dreams. The narrative of Africa's rise is often framed in terms of its relationship with external actors, whether it be former colonial powers, emerging economies like China, or international institutions. However, the true measure of Africa's progress will not be found in the amount of foreign investment it attracts, nor in the number of infrastructure projects it completes, but in the well-being of its people, the strength of its institutions, and its ability to chart its own course in a complex and rapidly changing world. Africa's ascent will be driven not by dependence on foreign aid or investment, but by the ingenuity, creativity, and resilience of its own people. It will be fueled by the entrepreneurial spirit of its youth, the wisdom of its elders, and the unwavering determination of its women, who have always been the backbone of their communities. This ascent will require a commitment to sustainable development, one that balances economic growth with environmental protection, social inclusion, and the preservation of cultural heritage. It will demand a focus on innovation, on harnessing the power of technology to create solutions to Africa's unique challenges, from improving healthcare outcomes to enhancing agricultural productivity. The world is watching, eager to see whether Africa can fulfill its immense potential, to witness the emergence of a continent that is no longer defined by poverty, conflict, or dependence, but by its vibrant cultures, its innovative spirit, and its unwavering determination to shape its own destiny. The narrative of Africa's rise is still being written. The chapters ahead remain unwritten, full of promise and possibility. The time has come for Africa to seize its moment, to embrace its potential, and to write its own story, a story of hope, resilience, and enduring progress.